Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Brad Hutnick.
And I'm Greg Edge.
We're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. Good morning, Gregor.
Guten Morgen.
See, now you're getting into it, right? Like, you're not German. You don't even, that made my day, Greg. That made my day.
When I went to Germany, I learned all the lines I needed to travel, and that was Ein Bier bitte.
See.
And I think wie viel is like how much? Like asking how much. Anyway.
Wow.
My small amount of travel vocabulary.
So, quick question for you.
Yep.
What are we talking about today?
Well, today, Brad, on SilviCast, you'll be happy to know we are going to talk about everything Eastern black walnut.
Oh, I love walnut.
Yeah. You like walnut?
Well, we can use it for a million things, right? Like, you have the traditional uses, but we can use it for the nuts.
Yeah.
You can put walnuts in your basement and keep spiders away.
What?
You can do it. Ask people from the Ozarks. That's what they do.
Do you have to put the husk down there so you get like this gooey blob sitting in your basement?
You might want to put them in something. I wouldn't want to lay them on the good carpet, but
it might get a little smelly.
Oh my God. Can you imagine? You can make syrup out of it. Just like maple syrup, you can make walnut syrup.
I've heard that. Sounds disgusting, but
my favorite, Greg, is you can use it to make a walnut liqueur. It's called nocino.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's fantastic.
Well,
it's like a pastry in a shot glass. It's beautiful.
Is that the one that you make?
I know people who have access to things that make this, and yes, they do a fantastic job with it.
Oh, it sounds very interesting.
Mm.
I think the other day you said that there's a use for the nuts.
Oh.
There was a trivia question you asked me.
There was.
And what was that?
Well, I can't remember what the trivia question was, but the essence of it is that walnut, like pieces, like when you take a walnut and you take the meat out of it,
yeah,
you have a hull left behind. And if you pulverize that hull, it can be used in sandblasting. And so it was used in the last renovation of the Statue of Liberty as the medium that they used as part of the sandblasting. So walnuts are celebrating freedom in America.
I did not.
Oh yeah.
I didn't believe you when you said that. I was picturing them firing walnuts at the Statue of Liberty. Bonk.
That's an image right there, Greg. Like us trying to clean things with whole walnuts.
And I always remember I grew up in Appleton, which is kind of the Flatlander Fox Valley over in the eastern part of the state. And we didn't have a lot of walnuts. But when we did come across them, I always thought, geez, these things are great for chucking at things.
Oh.
And I always thought they look like a tennis ball and they'd be really good in these cannons we used to make as kids. We used to take pop cans or beer cans and cut out the bottoms and then tape them all together in a tube. And then we'd put a tennis ball down that tube, and then we'd squirt like lighter fluid in a hole and that we'd make in the bottom, and then we'd light that and then shoot the tennis ball out.
Oh.
And I thought you could throw walnuts that way. That'd be cool.
The only difference is the walnut would hurt as opposed to the tennis ball, I guess.
You just have to get the right size.
Yeah. Oh, can you imagine? No, I grew up in Stevens Point, and I remember seeing walnuts for the first time when I was in Madison. And just being so impressed. Greg, you would appreciate this. I actually gathered up walnuts by the bagful, took them home to my family's farm and planted them.
Out on the sand.
Out on the sand. And I think we have 3 survivors. And this would have been when my wife Mary, we were dating at the time, just dating. So this is a long time ago. And those, they have still not reached, at least the ones that are there, they still haven't reached pole size.
I can't imagine why.
But the quality, Greg, the quality.
Planted alongside the potatoes.
Yeah, and the cactus. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least they have like really tight growth rings. So if you ever want to, make some cool wood.
Yeah, you're talking about my grandkids. I think my great-grandkids will be talking about those trees.
That was a very interesting rabbit hole, but I think today we're going to talk a little bit more silviculture and walnut. And I know we've had some listeners in the walnut range that have said, can you do an episode on walnut? So rather than sit here and listen to us prattle on about the many uses of walnut, we invited a real black walnut silviculturist. Today, Brad, on SilviCast, we're going to be joined by Lenny Farlee, who is extension forester at Purdue University. So Lenny's coming to us from the heart of the Black Walnut Range, Indiana, and he literally brings decades of experience in many facets of managing black walnut trees. So he's worked in the nurseries to private lands management to research and extension. So we're really going to be able to delve into some of the details on this unique species.
Oh, fantastic. You remind me, I'll have to ask him about walnut liqueur.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be all over that.
This season of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the SilviCast world go round, so thank you. Lenny Farlee, welcome to SilviCast. For our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work, and what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I work at Purdue University, West Lafayette campus. I'm an extension forester, 100% extension appointment. And so I'm working with private landowners and professionals doing extension programming, providing extension media of a variety of different types.
Cool. And you're working a lot with walnut, right?
Yes. So I'm also attached to the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center. And I have to get an inhale after saying that. It's a Purdue and Forest Service partnership that is working on improvement of hardwood trees, everything from tree improvement genetics to silviculture and ecology. And walnut is one of our big species that we concentrate on.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
You mean HTIRC doesn't just roll off the tongue?
Not exactly.
Not exactly. Took me a while to get used to that. When I was getting ready for this show, I looked up your bio over on the Purdue website. I saw like a number of different things there, and I thought, oh, I can relate to this. You've had a lot of different roles over your career, it looks like. You've worked maybe in nurseries, and you've worked as sounds like a private lands forester, and worked in research and extension. So I can kind of relate. I've never been in extension or research, but the nurseries and the private land. And I'm just curious, when you look back over all those roles, is there something that you think was the coolest job that you've had?
Probably. It's difficult. I really enjoy what I do now, kind of the bigger scale educational programming, reaching big audiences, but I really love the individual landowner contact on their properties of a private lands forester, district forester, they call it here in Indiana. So that was a great job.
Yeah, I missed that too. But I also like, and I think you're kind of in this area, you're sort of in extension, that intersection between that field work and that research. And I think that's a really cool area to be in as well.
Great opportunities, to really spread the word of what we're finding out in the science side.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool you both have a nursery background, because I wouldn't have imagined, did that come with early childhood education, kind of a background like that too?
You feel like that sometimes when you're operating at a nursery.
Yeah,
so yes.
Yeah.
Something like that, Brad. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Something like that.
We're, raising the tree babies.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So Lenny, when Brad and I were looking into doing a show on black walnut, we kind of explored that because we had a lot of requests for doing an episode on this. We have a lot of listeners kind of from that black walnut heart of that range. And also for people who are outside that area, they may not understand kind of the importance of Eastern black walnut. And so can you just say something about why is there so much interest and focus on this one particular species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so a lot of it goes back to the historical value associated with black walnut timber and particularly veneer. It has pretty consistently through history been the premier hardwood species in Eastern North America in terms of value both here and then also interest across the world for exports as well. And so folks that were interested in really tapping into a tree that had really superior marketplaces and great potential for high values, black walnut historically and still really probably is the best choice.
I'm always curious about this because you hear about people talking about black gold, right? Like these trees are so valuable, and you hear about rustlers. So one of the urban myths, well, you do, like you hear about people just absconding. And I read an urban myth that said that people have done walnut with helicopters as well in the past. But is there a illegal demand for, like, are people stealing them in actuality?
Absolutely, yes. And so particularly occasionally in market downturns, we had a little spate of this, I think, back in 2008 to 2010. The amount of walnut theft that was going on across the countryside here in Indiana increased because people understood the values. We've got sawmills around that will buy gate logs, essentially. And so it was an opportunity for people to pull, like you say, black gold out of unattended properties. We've actually been able to tackle that a little bit by doing some genetic work to match the stump to the log and actually tag some people for illegally harvesting timber.
Wow.
And so we've got some better tools now to actually track that down, where historically it was pretty tough to do.
Wow.
For those that don't work with that species, can you give us an idea like what the relative value is? Say for somebody cutting red oak woods run versus what walnut is going for.
Yeah, so I actually pulled some figures off of a really nice Ohio State publication that looks at timber values in Ohio. And so 2023, prime delivered log values were $1.50 to $3.50 a board foot. Number one logs were $1.10 to $2.75 a board foot. And so when you start talking about stumpage, they had values of $1 to $3 a board foot for stumpage. And then you look at veneer, and you might be looking at trees that are upwards of $15 to $20 a board foot.
Yeah.
So the values are just in some cases spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. Whereas we're looking at, oak stumpage prices that are a quarter of that, and then doesn't even touch, like you said, Lenny, the veneer prices can go quite high.
Yeah.
Yeah. Probably the species right now that's in the same ballpark, although not as high on the upper end as black walnut, is white oak, both in terms of saw timber and veneer values. And historically, 20 years ago, black cherry in our area popped up, and saw log values were a little higher than black walnut for a while. But that's been kind of an aberration as compared to what the normal trends have shown.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was always impressed with the walnut sales I would go to where the trees were numbered.
Yes.
So there were like 20 trees in that sale, and compared to like when we put out acres of trees, and approximately how many trees you have, because it's just a complete difference in the focus.
Yeah, it really is. And that's pretty common practice here in Indiana, particularly on the veneer trees, to number them.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets to something, Brad, you and I have discussed and always curious about walnut is sometimes when we as foresters are discussing it, it's almost like we're talking about managing an individual tree or species, whereas everything else we sort of manage as communities or cover types or systems. So is walnut management, is it single tree management or single species management, or are we managing stands or both?
Yes, that's a great question, Greg. Because a walnut naturally is pretty widely distributed, but also widely scattered. I think I saw a figure, it's like 7% of the volume here in Indiana, not in the top 10 in terms of total volume by species. I think it's number 11 or 12. So as a natural part of our woodlands is typically kind of scattered trees. You will occasionally find small stands that are either mostly walnut or a high percentage of walnut, mostly in creek bottoms, small river bottoms that don't have a lot of high amplitude flooding. As you go further west to Missouri and Kansas, you can kind of pick up density of black walnut. Some of their stands have a lot more black walnut in terms of total number of trees versus other species compared to us in Indiana. So for most people that are managing woodlands, yeah, it's really kind of individual tree management with the exception of those small little patches where we've got the right disturbance regime, and particularly the right soils to have walnut that regenerated all together and formed a small stand.
Yeah, so they're focusing in on that species individually, and as you're saying that a lot of those walnut, and this is true in Wisconsin too, are sort of a mixed component of oftentimes a central hardwoody type of stand or
Absolutely.
and so we're managing that larger stand component, but with a focus on that walnut because it's so high value.
Yeah, if you're interested in the economics, it's kind of an automatic crop tree in a lot of cases if it's got any kind of quality to it at all.
Yeah. I know it's interesting in Wisconsin, and just doing a little research for this episode. Here in Wisconsin, it's like you said, walnut stands themselves are not very common, but the volume is actually concentrated. So where we do get those stands, and actually I imagine most of them are plantations, that's where almost half of the volume occurs in those areas.
Yeah, that would not be dissimilar here in many cases.
If we were backing up or just thinking about, so we're managing trees, but we occasionally get to manage stands. In either event, we kind of have that background silvics of black walnut that we have to deal with. So for our listeners who may not work with walnut or may not be familiar with it that much, just thinking about basic things like, is it shade tolerant or is it not tolerant of shade?
Not tolerant. And so it wants to be in full sunlight, and it will strive to stay in the main canopy, and typically will only survive as a co-dominant and really kind of wants to be a dominant, particularly on good sites. And that's really kind of the other thing with black walnut is if you don't have it on the right kind of soils, and the right kind of soils are a deep 3 feet minimum without impediments in terms of drainage, high quality soils, so good tilth, silt loams, sandy clay loams is what we're really looking for. It doesn't perform well. It'll grow a lot of places, but it doesn't do real well. And obviously, a lot of times won't be very competitive on some of those more off-site type of locations for itself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I always thought that was interesting because our natural heritage folks complain about walnut eking into goat prairies.
Yeah.
Because it comes up in lots of different places, as you said, intolerant, so kind of openings and things like that. But yeah, to get the quality to the stems, that soil has to be of that different nature.
Yeah, a lot of site amplitude. I mean, like you say, everything from marginally wet to dry, probably more to the dry side than the wet side. It really doesn't like saturated soils at all. But it'll plug along on those sites. But yeah, in terms of growth rate and quality, it's always struggling in those locations.
Yeah. You may remember, Greg, we had a forester that we worked with back in the day, and he had a saying, because he loved to plant walnut. And even on those marginal sites, he would plant walnut. And his saying was something along the line of, why plant a Pontiac when you can grow a Cadillac?
And we will sometimes do the same thing. Popping a little bit of walnut in just to see if it might, handle the site. It usually doesn't hurt you much if you're, doing high density tree plantings. You can kind of judge it after that 10 or 15 years and, do I have something here?
Yeah. I always think some of the nicest walnut I see, both naturally and planted, is that depth of soil that you said, Lenny, but also I think you also mentioned drainage. So kind of that toe slope.
Yeah.
Sort of environment. It just really seems to do nicely in that kind of that little niche here in the hills.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost think of it as a cove species in some respects. Those really high quality mesic sites.
Good way to think of it.
Is it a pioneer on those sites? Because I've seen it in open areas pretty aggressively, but I'm curious about the rest of the range.
Yeah, if there's seed source nearby, and particularly squirrel planted, it can act like a pioneer. And one of the characteristics it's got that allows it to spread into the agricultural environment is it'll come through sod and other heavy weed growth, that big, heavy seed. And so it'll actually pioneer some spots where other species that maybe are lighter seeded, things like tulip tree, don't get in. So I see, I've observed that here in Indiana, abandoned pastures, places where we've abandoned fields and got heavy weed growth. The walnut will be one of the best ones to come into those areas. Probably one of our challenges there is that because it is mostly animal disseminated, the density sometimes isn't what you want.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage people, if they're looking at utilizing those old field areas, to get rid of the competing vegetation so that you can get a bunch of volunteers part of it being walnut, and then you're going to have a stand that'll actually produce some quality walnut, not the
Mhm.
orchard trees that you get with that really wide spacing.
Yeah. Speaking of seed, what kind of a seed producer is walnut? Is it really consistent? Does it have, very specific mast years like an oak would? How does that work?
It tends to be pretty consistent. It does have up and down years, but its heavier crops tend to come closer together than what I observed for oak. And
Mhm.
so looking at some of the silvicultural information for it said it would have a decent crop every 2 to 5 years. And I think that's what I observe on the landscape. And probably you could count on a really strong crop at least once or twice in a 5 year period. It seems to me almost like the really poor crops are less frequent than the good crops are.
Hmm. Do we know what those are related to? Like what kind of conditions set walnut up for good crops or bad crops?
I don't know exactly. I think there probably is some of that cycling, the carbohydrate balance in the tree, its capacity to produce a really good crop. The kind of prime bearing age for these trees is like 20 to 30 years, up to 100 years or so. But they'll bear as soon as 7 or 8 years, a lot of times from a seedling.
Hmm.
And being on a good site obviously also helps them a lot in terms of that carbohydrate balance. So all those kind of figure in.
It's the one hardwood seed in the nursery that we can usually count on will be able to get seed.
Yeah, that's very true.
So that tells you something, right?
Yeah, very consistent.
Actually, and I live in a small town, Spring Green, and we have walnuts everywhere. I think on most occasions can people get rid of their seed
Right,
here?
exactly.
Because there's so much of it.
Bit of a nuisance in the yard. That's
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yep. Lenny, thinking about a walnut maybe from a different angle, and we know that it occurred sporadically, like in these natural stands historically. Do we know anything about the disturbance that might have lent itself to maybe favoring walnut in certain areas?
Yeah, so I haven't seen a lot of historical work done on that, although where we see it would suggest probably things like tornadoes and straight line winds would have been favorable to it to create open stand conditions. It will sprout back from fires. A larger fire that maybe would top kill quite a few trees in an area would probably favor regeneration of new walnut. So even perhaps really strong flooding events that cleared an area, you might get an opportunity from nearby walnuts on upland slopes that survive to drop seed down into those areas and pioneer. Almost anything where you're really creating a pretty open light, high light availability opportunity for walnut to come in. It can get in there if you can get seed to that location. I think that's the big limiting factor a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
I always knew I could get an old boss going because I would say, I think it's a fire adapted species. Because then once you start talking about burning in a walnut stand, everybody's hackles go up.
Oh, yeah.
But we would talk about it, being really late to leaf out compared to most of the other trees in our area, and then losing its leaves really early. And then, like you said, it'll sprout back like oak in a lot of ways. And I don't know, maybe it's even like the wood durability, but I just can't say I've seen that many hollow walnuts in my career.
Yeah. It has good wound compartmentalization, pretty thick bark. And so I think there's a strong argument to be made that barring the concern about quality issues,
right.
Fire could be used as a tool, at least for preparations of areas to be suitable for walnut, and maybe in that early period where it's not a big deal if you top kill it, if you're taking back other competing regeneration.
Yeah.
Potentially, thinking about this, lots of different significant disturbances that just created that more open light condition. But as you said, it's a heavy seed, so getting the seed to that location becomes critical. So that probably, in a way, limited how much it was dispersed across those areas.
I think so. If they were floatable, water could carry them to some extent, but it's mostly squirrels that are doing the work for us.
Since we're talking here about natural disturbance regimes, I wanted to talk a little bit, ask you a few questions about natural regeneration. A lot of walnut, as you know, and here in Wisconsin as well, is artificially planted, and we're going to talk about that. But we often don't talk about natural regeneration in walnut other than working with what we got that comes along. So I tried to do some looking and couldn't find much, but is there any research on sort of natural regeneration methods in walnut, or is that very limited?
It seems to be very limited because I've done some of the same searching, and most of our research here has been concentrated on planting and direct seeding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're right. I think people have taken what they've gotten, but I think the good news is that if you have walnut seed source available, you can oftentimes get it. You just have to create the right conditions for that seedling to do well. And so I see it like I say, pioneering old abandoned agricultural areas, and some of the really strong walnut patches or stands I've run into, I'm pretty sure were either an old pasture or a field that got abandoned and it had walnut on the edge.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of the natural approach. Something I've thought about in walnut stands in terms of harvesting management is I think a shelter wood is probably going to still be too much shade for walnut to do well. It just does not last under shade any amount of time. You really can't build up a seedling store. They have to get sunlight quick. And so I'm wondering if a seed tree approach in some of these locations where you've got walnut that's casting good seed, you create an environment where those seed are close enough that the squirrels can spread it into your area, but you don't have the shading. That might be a possibility, but I don't know if anybody's done any research on that.
Yeah. It is interesting. And you mentioned that shade tolerance, and we're kind of thinking about like a shelter wood with something like that. It is curious. You don't see walnut very often in the understory of like these open stands. It's more like along the edges or kind of just out into an opening a little bit, but not all that common as an understory tree.
I see it for 1 at most 2 years.
Yeah.
And so I'll follow seed crops in some of these locations, and we'll see a flush of walnut coming up. And like you say, these open understories, but it's a 70 to 80% plus canopy closure. And yeah, they don't last but a couple of years, and then they're done.
It's interesting to think about seed tree. Is there ever a problem? And I don't know if I've ever seen this in a field where, like you did say, we get those loose or those open conditions where you kind of get those more oak orchard crowns. But I imagine it's a great sprouter. You could kind of continually set things back until you had the density you wanted and work with something like that.
I think that's a potential management approach. Yeah, just keep working things back. It coppices so well. You've got that established root system. You're probably going to get better quality sprouts off of it once you've got that density up. And so I think that's a viable approach. And yeah, we just need some people to do it and tell us how it works out. So
That's right.
What do you think if a forester was working? We have just like you, a lot of small woodlots, kind of small area, and maybe they're setting up a harvest prescription that has some type of groups or patches. Do you have any idea like how big an opening you think would be appropriate? And maybe you have to put, as you said, some seed trees within that in order to have that dispersal of seed. I'm just curious on an opening size.
Yeah, so I have actually done a little bit of that on my property, and I think you could do 1 and 2 acre openings and have walnuts retained on the edges, and squirrels would do some of that work for you. The issue we've got here in Indiana is we've got a lot of tulip tree, and so it moves faster than the walnut does. And so I have done a combination of direct seeding, seedling planting, and also looking for natural regeneration. And then I go in after 3 or 4 years and I start breaking the tops out or clipping the tops out of the tulip tree around my walnut to make sure they've got that cone of light. And it does a great job of training them. But boy, if you don't do it, they're 2 feet, 3 feet above the walnut after 4 or 5 years if you're not careful.
As we're talking about assisted migration with tulip poplar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lenny's going, no, don't.
It's a great tree, but boy, it's competitive.
Yeah.
Like you said, all we need is some foresters out there to maybe play around with this some more and try some more of this. But I do like that idea of having, maybe openings, patches with either border or anchor seed trees within that to get that distribution.
I think it's a real possibility. The other thing I've done is I have done direct seeding, and I learned a hard lesson. Don't pick a poor seed crop year to direct seed because the squirrels find every single one of them. But good crops, direct seeding can work, and it's a pretty simple process. You go out there with a shovel, put the seed in about an inch or 2 deep. You've got a good chance of getting a seedling in that location.
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the SilviCast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show. I'm curious, Greg, over our career, so you've been with the DNR, Greg, like 60 years now. So you've been here a long time.
Something like that, yeah.
But those of us may be here for a lot less, So, but over the last 30 years, I'd say our plantings have changed. We've gone from low densities to higher densities, and so maybe it's really good to get a glimpse of what things look like at the heart of the empire for Indiana. I'm curious, like we used to just plant straight walnut.
Yeah.
Like, because, it's like doing that. And do you still do that, or do you mix the species up now?
I still see that happen, but I really like the mixed plantings a lot better. I've done a lot of thinning, marking in solid walnut plantations, and if they're not mown, it's no fun at all.
Yeah.
That's a light canopy, and so there's always heavy weed growth in the understory. I don't think the walnuts provide the best competition for each other in terms of training and branch pruning. And so I see much better quality walnuts in mixed species plantings. A common practice in northern Indiana for years from some foresters up there was alternating rows of white pine and hardwoods. And typically, if they are in the right kind of sites, they were throwing walnut in there. And walnut really does pretty good in that environment if it's a good site. If it's a really good site, the walnuts will whip the white pine with the combination of growth and jugulone.
Yeah.
And you almost get some natural thinning. If it's a little marginal, you're going to have to kill the white pine because they'll continue to hang in there with time. But it's a good system. And so, yeah, I'm all for mixed species plantings because one of the things it does, it knocks down the understory a lot better. Walnut solid planted just does not do that.
What do the densities look like that foresters are putting in down there now?
Yeah, we're doing the same thing you folks are, and a lot of it's deer pressure and just a recognition of competition, and that's tighter spacings. I think we commonly are recommending 8x8 for tree plantings with walnut in it. Some people are planting even a little tighter. Historically, we were more on the 10x10. The early recommendations were 12x12. I think both of those are too wide to produce the kind of quality you'd like to see on your walnut. So we're pinching down the densities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely been the trend here too. I know when we started putting in walnut in the 80s with the CRPs, we were at like 15 foot spacings. And now, yeah, we're probably down to 7-8 foot spacings would be more typical. And some folks, especially if there's oak in there, would go high density.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot mixed up with oak in our area too.
Yes.
Kind of red oak and some other different species.
I think that red oak walnut mix, if you can protect it from deer, is a good mix. If the red oak aren't being chewed up by deer, they are pretty good comparable growth rate with black walnut on those good sites.
Yeah. I suppose that's a little bit of a challenge because walnut's a pretty fast grower. It's always that surprising thing to me. It's really valuable and it's not a slow grower.
Yeah, once again, site related. If you've got it where it's happy, it's a very aggressive, strong grower that wants to be in the main canopy. So that's a big advantage.
Yeah.
What about plantings down there in terms of stock? Are most of the plantings still bare root stock, or is direct seeding popular? What does that look like?
Still mostly bare root stock. We've got an excellent state nursery and also several private nurseries providing stock in the bare root. And so that's really quite common still. There are some people that are doing a little bit of direct seeding. I don't know anybody that's done as much as one of my friends now departed, unfortunately, in Iowa, Larry Croats did.
Yeah, I remember. I know Larry.
Yep. Do you guys know Larry?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just a legend and fantastic results with his heavy tens of thousands of seeds per acre direct seeding. And I saw his plantings, and he's got some fantastic trees that just look like they're woods grown, producing great quality.
Yeah.
So more than one way to skin that cat, but most people are doing bare root seedling planting.
Yeah, I remember when Larry was around and he sort of evangelized the direct seeding route, and a lot of foresters were skeptical, but then a lot of foresters adopted some of it and goes, "Oh, this works pretty good."
Yeah. It does. Yeah. Yeah.
But he planted a lot of species, right?
Yes.
and maybe a tangent, but it was like, if it's a tree, I'll take it kind of stuff.
Yeah, he was just looking to get the stocking, and I think he was really intelligent to do that, and had really good results as an outgrowth of that approach.
Yeah,
I think the biggest controversial item Larry would do was overseed with box elder seed.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to get that density.
Yep. One of the things I think that's an advantage to, though, and it's kind of the white pine here, is there's really no great market for white pine. And so the hardest thing we have to get landowners to do is thin after they've planted. And if you can tell them there's no value in keeping this,
right,
they're much more willing to do that sacrifice of that tree. Where our solid walnut plantings, getting people to thin those sometimes is like pulling teeth.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They're sure each one of those trees is going to make them money.
Yeah.
And it just cannot happen,
Yeah.
I have seen, and we've had discussions about walnut a lot in a climate change perspective, and thinking about assisted migration and the different forms that it takes. But it seems to me like, based on some of the conversation here, I've seen it as a projected quote unquote winner with,
yes,
like basically having new habitat. But it sounds like we have to be careful. So when we think about people doing enrichment plantings, if it's in that understory, you may really want to be much more cognizant about, don't just put it in the understory and think it's going to be there in the future. You may have to really set the stage for it.
Yeah, it's not one that it's going to hang around like oak in a stand that's got 50 or 60% canopy cover. It cannot tolerate that. So you've really got to have the daylight to put it in. So it's something that's the result of a really open stand regeneration process or planting.
Yeah.
Lenny, have you seen much of that in Indiana, where what we would consider enrichment planting or going into those sort of degraded stands, pasture areas to try to reestablish it?
I have done a little bit of that with some landowners here in Woodlands, and with some success. So we have done plantings in forest openings with bare root stock. One of them was a 8x8 planting with walnut in the center and oak on the outside edge. It was about an acre opening. And those walnuts, they were on a near perfect site, and they were growing 0.4 of an inch in diameter a year over about a 30-year period. And that was the crop trees that we had selected to keep on that area. So we had excellent results. He worked really hard the first couple of years for weed control. Pokeberry just came in like a flood.
Yeah.
But after that couple of years, it was kind of stand back for 10, 12 years. No pruning to speak of. Came in and started doing thinning. We already had really great formed stems. And now it's off to the races. It's a great looking stand.
So it sounds like your cautionary item with that is, though, getting the right light conditions and the right site.
Absolutely essential. You want to check your soils and make sure that you've got plenty of daylight. And I think an acre is minimum. We had a couple of slightly smaller openings that did not perform nearly as well for the walnut. The oak did significantly better. So if you're looking at those smaller openings, you really have to grade your trees in terms of their intolerance to shade, and walnut wants a lot of daylight.
Mm-hmm. I get the question sometimes from landowners who have that sort of situation, maybe small areas, and they want a direct seed. And I know we've had instances where direct seeding gets a lot of predation on the small areas like that. I don't know. Have you seen that or had experience with that?
Yeah, in my woods, I've done some of that, and I'll go back. I think if you don't have a really heavy seed crop and a lot of other food available for the squirrels, it's an exercise in futility, unless you protect your seed. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things we've done in some direct seeding with some of our approaches here at HTIRC is we actually will put a short tree tube with like a wire mesh cover on the top and sink it into the ground a little bit, and just to keep the squirrels off of them. Now, that's a big input in terms of effort and dollars for each of those little direct seeded seedlings, but we've got a lot in those. I think if landowners really pick a year where it's a big seed crop, if they've got a lot of walnut in the woods, they've got an opportunity to move that stuff from out of the shade into the sun. They've got a pretty good chance of having some success there.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, Greg, you may remember I had another boss, and
you've had a lot of bosses.
A lot of bosses. Yeah. That's another story. I always remember landowners get really attached too. Like when they start growing these walnut in these plantations, that's That's like it can consume them in some ways. And I
Yes.
remember one time we had a landowner, and he said, because we went out there and it was hard to find a tree that hadn't been pruned or hadn't been stopped and looked at, because the gator could reach every tree that he had, his UTV. And so I remember him saying, some people like to golf, some people like to prune walnut. And that's what it felt like. Like there were two sets of minds, but they didn't cross. But speaking of that pruning, when would you start? It's something I've never done, but when would you start to think about pruning, and what would that look like?
So there's a lot of debate and philosophy involved in this. My philosophy personally is I kind of had a really good forest economics professor here at Purdue, Bill Hoover, who told me costs early in the plantation have to be carried through to rotation.
Yeah.
And so if it's truly an investment, you got to be thinking about how much money am I going to spend on this thing? Now, if you love to prune, I say start pruning relatively early. So maybe after 3 or 4 years, literally, you could go out and take off forks. That's a good starting point. And so just try to maintain some level of apical dominance. That'll make you feel better. I will tell you that I don't think you have to do it.
Yeah.
I think if you plant it 8 by 8, you wait for 10 or 12 years, let that develop. You're going to pick out crop trees. At that point in time, you can look at doing some pruning. You'll have enough density that you will have already killed a lot of lower branches. And so you can take off the deads, do the appropriate pruning with some branches that are maybe getting a little bit of size, or take a fork out. But I think the competition will have done a lot of that work for you. For folks who don't want to do that high density or want to be really engaged, I would say start with form. And so you're always looking to keep a straight stem. That's your job number one, because that adds logs, and we need that log length. And then number two, remove the largest branches before they get larger. And so you're taking off things on your bottom log before they get 1.5 inches in diameter or so. Now that comes at a cost, as does competition. We're reducing growth. But I tell everybody that planting walnut is an intergenerational activity.
Yeah.
And so just do the best job you can managing for your grandkids, as opposed to thinking you're going to get anything out of it. And that's a good way to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the draws with Larry's method of direct seeding, was getting that density high enough that they actually self-pruned. And I think Larry would say, I don't like to prune, so I want them self-pruning. So I think that density is really, really key to get around that.
Absolutely. And we've been playing around with what's the best nurse tree to some extent. And, white pine can be pretty good. We actually used some river birch in some plantings, and that worked pretty nice. The shape of the tree and the kind of lighter canopy actually worked pretty well with walnut. But I'm not going to say we've figured it out completely yet. But I think those are a couple of possibilities. And then we mentioned red oak as a possible companion too.
Yeah. Lenny, you could light a fire in our audience if you said that black locust was a really good trainer for it.
I'm not going to do that. So. There's some pop from the nitrogen, but what I've seen here in Indiana is if it's not watched, the black locust will overrun the walnut. Contrary to what I've seen in some of the literature, my experience has been that black locust is too aggressive.
Yeah.
Lenny, I bring up this topic with a little bit of caution, because I think we could talk about do a show just on this. But I think talking to you at Purdue, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about walnut genetics, because when I first started, the big hullabaloo was Purdue #1s and that particular patent of that walnut, and we had landowners that wanted to plant it and all of that. But I know through some of your colleagues that, walnut genetics have evolved since that time, and there's a lot been done. So I just kind of get an idea from you, sort of what the current state of walnut genetics is. What are people planting? Where is it going? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And so, Purdue #1 did raise a lot of interest, and it still is a good tree in terms of form. A lot of the thought and projections on growth ended up not being very accurate. It's kind of a moderate, just a basically average grower. It's not a super duper in terms of growth speed, but it does have a form advantage pretty consistently. But where we're headed now, that was primarily clonal or grafting. So you got a a scion off and you actually had a graft of that copy of Purdue #1. Where we're headed now is much more diversity in terms of family lines of black walnut, and then essentially taking the progeny of these improved orchards and planting the kids out. And so we're trying to figure out what moms produce the best kids. And those are the trees that are going to stay in the orchard. And we're going to use that to produce a diverse set of walnut lines, not just one line that'll be available for planting. And based on the evidence I've seen so far, I think one of the big advantages of this tree improvement program is we're starting to rogue out the low end of these selections. And so the selections that have really poor growth, that have poor form. And so when you get this improved stock, what you're really getting is not something that's light years ahead of all other walnut, but we've taken off some of the risk of having really bad genetics. And so I want to temper everybody's expectations. I think that's been one of the problems.
Yeah.
Advertisements that we were going to be rich in 25 years. Well, we've been doing this for longer than 25 years, and that's not happened.
Yeah.
So it takes a long time to grow quality, even on good sites. But if we've got trees that have been tested and shown to be, on average, even if it's small percentages, like in the teens, better than nursery run, you could plant some of those out, wider spacings in a higher density plantings, 20 to 40 feet apart, not have the whole planting there. And you've got an opportunity to take advantage of those genetics. But one of the things we've seen with genetics also is, once again, you've got to be on the best sites.
Right.
We're on marginal sites, the genetic advantages disappear.
So keeping that wide genetic base, but it still does not compensate totally for, the silvics and the silviculture of growing those.
Absolutely. It's one part of a big system, and really the low-hanging fruit is site selection and good culture, good silviculture.
Yeah. And that's kind of the definition of long-term research, right? Like, you guys are looking at progeny. How big do those have to get before you make a determination that, hey, this was a successful or better form than maybe some of its competitors?
Yeah, there's been some research on that shows typically around year 8 to 12, we've got a pretty good idea of what that tree is going to look like more in the future. And I think it's important to carry it out either a little further, because a lot of times our first thinning in these plantations is somewhere between year 10 and 15, depending on growth rate. And that's where we're going to pick our crop trees. And so we want to make sure that we're seeing that performance at that point in time, and that it carries through to make good decisions on that crop tree selection and when we start doing that thinning. That's why it takes so long to get this done. It's a waiting game to see how those kids perform from that first generation of selections.
Yeah. So you mentioned thinning. I think a lot of us who've been, we went to school, we heard about walnut, and then we heard about crown competition factor.
Yes.
And it was one of those that I have to admit I never used. We always just went in and looked at kind of the better examples and things like that. But now that we're talking to the, the heart of the walnut empire and you, Lenny, what is crown competition factor?
So it's a measure of crown size. And so the idea is that they're looking at what is the kind of optimum size of a walnut that has the opportunity to grow without competition. How big would its crown be? And then how many of those could we put on an acre? And then we will go into an area, and based on the relationship of crown diameter to actual tree diameter, DBH, there is a mathematical relationship there. And so we can do diameter measurements and get an idea based on the average diameter and the number of trees per acre, what that crown competition factor is. If it's 100, we have a site that is fully occupied with trees that have had the full capacity to grow to their best. If it's over 100, we are diminishing the ability of individual trees to grow at their best. We're diminishing that crown size. If it's under 100, we've got still a little bit more room to grow those trees in a not super competitive environment. And so it's a really pretty useful measure to get a gauge of, when we're thinking about something like black walnut, where we really want to target in on individual trees of really high quality, is our stand in a position where we can kind of optimize the growth on those trees. And so in that respect, it's very helpful. It's kind of a big, ugly calculation, though. But the nice thing is that the Iowa State University years ago produced this forestry guide, and in it they put a stocking chart that looks a lot like the Gingrich charts that every forester in the Midwest has used, only it uses CCF instead of stocking on one side, and then it's got diameter, basal area, and trees per acre on the axes. And so you can access that, and I think we've got that website available for the resources in this, and print that out. And when you go into a plantation, use that. And so once you've got either basal area and diameter or basal area and trees per acre, you can see what your crown competition factor is and make thinning decisions based on that.
It sounds like it's almost a form of relative density in a way.
Yes.
And I think on the charts, and you sent Brad and I those charts, it's on the left side of the diagram, just like we're looking at relative density of stocking.
Yeah. It's a handy little chart that I think foresters will relate to much better because they're used to using the Gingrich stocking charts. And this is laid out exactly the same way.
I just remember trying to use the formula and using the Walnut Manager's Handbook and sitting in a plantation going, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm just going to do crop tree release. So that's right.
Yeah, just go. I'll just pick out the crop trees and give them some release.
Yeah.
So I guess that being the case, so foresters can use this guide. It'll help them guide them on sort of the timing and the amount of thinning. But also, like when you're approaching a stand for thinning, maybe it's a plantation that's more solid walnut. What are some of the things that you're looking for in that operation, in the setup of it?
That's a great question. So one of the things I'm trying not to get in too big of a hurry, because one of the things I recognize is that competition is my best friend when it comes to quality development. And so I see some people that want to get in as soon as they see crowns touching and start doing things, and I'm not for that. I think we want to see that competition and the lifting of the crowns, the shading of those lower branches, the forcing of those stems to grow straighter to produce the quality. If you absolutely feel like you've got to maintain optimum growth through time, yeah, you're going to have to get your pruning equipment out and start to work. And then you're having an impact on growth then too, because you're taking off leaf area. But yeah, I try not to get in a hurry. So I, a lot of times, I'm not pushing people to do thinning until like year 12 or 15 on those 8x8 spacings. And then I am starting to look at what's the shape of that crown, particularly the trees that have produced the best quality logs. Am I getting compression or flattening on those crown surfaces? That's my first indication that I've got problems and probably need to be thinking about doing some release. Although, and I think this was one of the questions you maybe had coming up, but I'm going to go ahead and tackle it, is how much release do we give walnut in view of the fact that with veneer, they really are looking for even growth for a couple of reasons, the aesthetics, but also the mechanics of the veneer itself. And talking to some of the veneer guys, they say, if these trees grow irregularly over time, the veneer tends to buckle in the manufacturing process. And so they do want a relatively even growth rate. So this 3 or 4-sided crop tree release for many of the trees that's been recommended is probably a little drastic for veneer quality walnut. And obviously, if you're working in a plantation and it's a landowner that's out there on the plantation, they could thin on a slower schedule, essentially removing one tree on that canopy maybe every 3 or 4 years and evening that growth out to keep that even growth and that nice wood character that the veneer guys are looking for.
Does the walnut respond very quickly to release when you're applying it like that?
It certainly seems to. Yes. Yeah, it does tend to respond to release and will grow aggressively into those areas to a point. I've seen walnut plantations that were planted 20 or 25 years ago and have never received any thinning, and practically every tree is still out there. It just seems to be a characteristic of walnut not to drop out, but just to gradually reduce canopy size. And usually they're all sprouting up and down the columns of the trunks. And you're way past when you can really do good work at that point, because you really degraded the quality of the wood with the sprouting, and you don't have a crown that's going to respond well to release. So timely thinning, definitely important.
Brad and I had a conversation with Jan Wiedenbach from the Forest Service about management of veneer, and that was kind of one lesson that I walked away from that conversation, was just trying to get that, at least on those highest value trees, because not all trees are the highest value trees, but that just that steady, consistent growth, whatever that is important.
That's what I've always heard too, and do buy into that. Absolutely.
So when we start to talk about thinnings, we're really kind of thinking about maybe potential markets. So it sounds like some of those very first thinnings, those are non-commercial. At least where you are, when do you start to see those markets develop for thinnings?
Yeah, we had an unusual situation. We've got a very large agroforestry planting here in Tippecanoe County that they did some thinning. These were good, high-quality trees that have been pruned through time and grown on really good sites. And he was actually selling to a local wood market, particular buyer, 8-inch top diameters, 8 and 9-inch top diameters.
Wow.
He said he may have put that guy out of business. So what I'm hearing from some of the guys that are in kind of the bigger, more mainline industry is they'll take 10-inch diameter black walnut, but they don't like a lot of it. They need it mixed with other larger diameter material.
Yeah.
They can utilize it, but the small diameter stuff has such high operating costs versus the wood value that it's a killer once they start running it through the mill. So what can be marketed versus what is economical to market, they really need that balancing point of they've got to have some bigger, better material. They can take some of the small diameter stuff, but it's tough to move. Mm-hmm. And so what we find is if we're not, 14, 15 inches DBH, it's probably going to not look very good in the market a lot of times.
Lenny, I have a question that kind of gets back to what we started with, and that was, are we managing individual trees or stands? But when we're looking at markets and trees and we're trying to decide on rotating these trees or stands, what types of things are you looking at in that sense? When do you rotate a stand of walnuts or an individual tree? Are there cues that you use?
Yeah. So actually, one of the things you can look at on walnut is the bark texture. And so this is actually pretty valuable in natural stands. A really long, continuous running ridges with quite a bit of space between the ridges, that tree is probably growing like gangbusters. Where real heavy alligator hide bark, that tree is probably growing quite slowly. And so it really will tell you a lot about its growth rate by the bark. And so that can tell us, is this a tree that we're actually going to see any kind of return on in the situation it's in based on its growth rate? And then we can also think about, what else is around it. And so if I've got a tree that is growing relatively slowly, but I've got some younger trees, younger walnut that are its progeny around it, it may be a good time to think about marketing it, even if it's not a super big tree, because we're not going to get it much bigger with any kind of, movement in time. Where if I've got a tree that either through looking at the bark or actually doing repeated measurements, I see still making good growth, there are market premiums for larger diameter, plus that whole volume curve that we get on, once you get to a certain area of diameter and also adding logs up the tree. And with walnut's value, even upper logs can, add considerable value to that tree. So, so looking at those conditions of tree health, growth rate, and then what their surrounding stand looks like, and then recognizing if you want to regenerate walnut, you're going to have to create light. And so that's going to push you in some situations. If you're really wanting to regenerate walnut, you're going to have to make some decisions about a larger area and multiple trees in a spot.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a balance between managing individual trees, but then what your stand level objectives are, and you're considering both at the same time and how to make those work together.
Yeah, and a lot of times, here in Indiana with our smaller woodlots in northern part of the state, the walnut is really the economic driver a lot of times in these woodlots. And so it's making a lot of the decisions for us in terms of when we're marketing, because it's going to be the sweetener that sells the rest of the woods.
Yeah. For people who haven't worked with it, I probably don't realize a single tree could sell a sale.
Right. Yes,
literally.
Absolutely. Yeah. It determines who shows up a lot of times.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting bit of silviculture that's a little different than all the other cover types we manage, because that individual aspect comes into play, and it's just interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Very unique in many cases. That's right.
Yeah. Lenny, I'm curious. We talked about, like maybe that bottom end of when they become commercial. But with walnut, and you mentioned that there's more value in bigger trees, but how big is too big, or is there a limit with walnut in some of the markets you've seen?
For a lot of people, it's kind of a risk evaluation. Every time the thunderstorm goes through and you hear the lightning strike, you hope it's not that really nice walnut tree out there.
Yeah.
And so, realistically, you're probably looking at, upper end. I would be moving trees that are 26, 28, 30 inches in diameter, even on good sites. I know a location just across the line in Wisconsin, near Beloit. The gentleman in the Walnut Council, he had trees on his property that were in the 30 plus to 40.
Wow.
And they had a sale, and that sale did fantastic.
Yeah.
So if you got the ground and you have the patience, I think there's probably an upper limit in terms of what the folks want to handle in terms of size. But I think, even in the 30 inches to, 3 feet, 36 inches, that's a totally acceptable size if you're growing that good quality tree and it's on a good site and in good health.
Yeah.
But it does become a risk evaluation then, because that's also, if you're talking about a veneer tree of that dimension, that's an enormous amount of capital sitting on the ground there that you hope nothing happens to.
Yep. But Lenny, you mentioned earlier, you talked about a large agroforestry planting where you're at. And we've been hearing a lot about walnut outside of just maybe the traditional markets.
Yeah.
So agroforestry has been one of those, but it seems like there's a lot of things brewing with walnut that way.
Yeah, one of the things that's popped up is the slab market. That's been churning for a while. I mean, we get unit values competing with veneer values with the live edge slabs. A Purdue professor here retired from our wood products group. He has a slab mill and was cutting pretty much any kind of walnut and cherry and oak he could get a hold of. And some of those boards had more holes than wood, and he was still able to sell them for $75 a board. And some of the really nice stuff, multiple hundreds for a really nice board. So there's that interesting marketplace of what normally would be pretty rough trees that we would have difficulty marketing otherwise. And then people are doing walnut syrup now too. But I always tell folks, the syrup may not be very compatible with your veneer goals in terms of those tap holes don't heal, they just seal. So they'll always be there. So that's an issue. And the yield on that is not like maple syrup. You don't get as much sap out of the tree, and you need a lot more sap to make the same amount of syrup with walnut. So those are options. And then, of course, the nuts. One of the big operators in Missouri, Hammond Nut Company, kind of has dominated the black walnut nut meat market. And there's a lot of work involved in extracting those nut meats. That's a pretty specialized area. But there's a variety of areas like that folks could look at as possibilities.
Yeah. I know on the agroforestry front, Greg, we've had discussions with people who were looking at it for a number of, so they were planting it in windrows or kind of rows within their agroforestry projects. And they were counting on that black walnut wood, so they could have that over time. And they were thinking about the nuts. I think in a lot of ways, they were mixing it with silvipasture and really wanted that shade for some of those, for the cows too. So
yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
And that light canopy probably would make it amenable to some pasturing like that.
Yeah.
Sounds like, Brad, you better start tapping those black walnuts that you got growing back on that little sand prairie of yours.
Well, it is interesting. If you think about tapping sugar maple, we do create that defect and we can get some discoloration and we get some other things. With walnut, I guess we're really not worried about discoloration, right? It's going to be dark no matter what, but it's that defect on the outside that gets kind of basically entombed within that tree over time.
Yeah, and you probably still will see a little bit of staining potentially, and so it would certainly have some impacts on the veneer area. Saw timber, like you say, if a defect is pretty even across the wood, sometimes it's a plus rather than a minus. So It depends on what people want to do with it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know I remember visiting a walnut plantation one time that was all wired up with taps, and the folks said, "Now, Lenny, breathe easily. This is their management objective." And so I had to accept that, So.
Try not to judge.
That's right.
That's right.
Lenny, this has been a really interesting conversation about all things walnut. We covered a lot of ground there. But it's just such an interesting species, and Brad and I have both appreciated working with it over the years, and it's just really nice to talk to you about some of these items. And compare notes, actually. So I just want to say thanks. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We all have a lot to learn on this still. There's a lot of work to be done, and I hope some of the conversations we have might encourage people to try some things and report back. We can all learn from each other on this situation.
Lenny, if listeners are interested in more information, should they go check out like the Purdue website basically for more info?
Please do. Purdue Forestry and Natural Resources Extension and the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center are all great sources of information. The other group that provides a wonderful connection to black walnut is the Walnut Council. And it looks like the Walnut Council is actually going to be meeting in either Illinois or southern Wisconsin for our next meeting in the Beloit area. And that'll be in late July of 2025. So that's an opportunity as well.
Cool.
Yeah, great.
Great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Well, Greg, sometimes it's nice to receive some affirmation that SilviCast is on the right track. And this week, we received a letter from a listener who really enjoys listening to SilviCast.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
That's cool.
I'll read you a little bit of it. I thought it was pretty good. Dear Greg and Brad, I wanted to write you not merely as a fan, but as a listener to SilviCast. I've really enjoyed the work that you've put into this and think that SilviCast is something that the entire forestry community should be more aware of. I shouldn't say I'm really a listener. I'm an acolyte and perhaps a worshiper at the cathedral of your sonic brilliance. From the first syllable of your intro music, I felt as though I were being pulled through a wormhole of enlightenment, flung headfirst into an alternate universe where clarity, wit, and intellect reign supreme. See, now, Greg, this is good writing.
Brad.
This is good.
Brad.
Your insights are not opinions. They're revelations. Your banter, not conversation. It's verbal jazz played on golden saxophones by celestial beings.
Brad.
I would sooner forsake food and water than miss an episode.
Brad, you've tried this before.
My doctor is concerned, but I've made peace with that.
Brad,
Greg,
you've tried this before. That's not a real letter.
One more line. In short, if Aristotle, Beyonce, and David Attenborough collaborated on a podcast in heaven, it might approach the grandeur of SilviCast, but I doubt it.
I'm glad that at least in your head, those are the words you hear.
And this is not what I hear. This is what a listener wrote to us, Greg.
Yeah.
So, no, we did not get this from a listener, but it is a reminder that we would really like to get feedback from listeners, unless you want us to keep making up these conversations, and I guarantee we can make them deeper and richer than this. You should just stop me. Just stop me, and we'll read normal
please,
letters.
Someone tell Brad to get a grip on reality.
Yeah.
That would be a more appropriate letter.
Yeah. So, in any event, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or comment if you like. And actually, just send us anything, right? You can send us your recipes for next week. We'll appreciate it.
Not a flowery letter.
Not a flowery letter. But remember, we always learn best when we wrestle with questions, so please keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.